Okay. Kia ora koutou katoa, kua karapine pine mai nei tēnei wā, kia inoi tātou. Po hiriri, po rarama, po o te whakaaro, po o te tangata, po o te aroha, te po e here nei I a tātou, Māori ora ki a tātou, humie, huie, tai, kie. Tēnā tātou katoa, ko gucha o te maunga, ko jeravia te awa, ko tarara te iwi, ko Serbia te hapu, ko Olivera Kamenarac tō kuinyoa. Nō reira, tēnā koto katoa. Nai mai, haere mai. Hello everyone and very warm welcome to the Early Years Research Center seminar organized by the Wilf Malcolm Institute of Educational Research at the University of Waikato. My name is Olivera Kamenarac and I'm a senior lecturer in the Division of Education and also co-director of Early Years Research Center. We are very pleased to host this seminar and see so many of you, and thank you so much for coming. Before we introduce our speakers, I would invite my colleague Melissa Derby, who is co-leading the Center, Early Years Research Center with me, to make one important announcement and say a couple of words. Melissa, the floor is yours.
Kia ora, thank you, Olivera, and welcome everybody to this afternoon's seminar. Olivera and I are thrilled to have you all here to hear our two wonderful speakers this afternoon. Before we get started with that, I'd just like to make an announcement about the Early Years Research Centre conference, which is coming up in July, Saturday the 8th of July. It will be held at our Waikato campus in Hamilton. We are currently in the throes of making sure, or at least attempting to hold a hybrid conference where we can also host people online just to, I guess, enable people who aren't able to be there face-to-face to join us. So we'll have an announcement, more information, I guess, coming out in due course. But for now, save the date, Saturday the 8th of July. The conference theme is celebrating 30 years of Te Whāriki draft. So Te Whāriki is the early childhood curriculum, obviously, in New Zealand, and it's had an impact not only here, but also in other countries around the world. So we're looking to reflect on all of the incredible impact that Te Whāriki has had thus far, and of course to project on where it might go in the future. So that's the conference theme. More information is coming out very quickly, but I just wanted to bring that to your attention now and to have you mark your diaries with that important date, the 8th of July. And I'll hand back to you now, Olivera.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Thanks a lot. Before we introduce our speakers, maybe just a few housekeeping rules. Please keep yourself on mute unless you are asking questions, which is going to happen at the end of the presentation. The presentation is recorded, and we are happy to share the recordings if you get in touch with us. And also there is a chat box available for any questions you would like our speakers and audience to discuss after we finish with presentation. So we today have two brilliant speakers, Emeritus Associate Professor Gordon Clivent from the University of Toronto, and Sue Covey from also who is president of Building Blocks for Childcare in Canada. And I invite Professor Linda Mitchell, to introduce our speakers. Thank you so much.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui ki a korua, Gordon and Sue. Welcome to everybody here today, especially to you, Sue and Gordon. We're really pleased to have you both to talk about the topic, moving towards universal childcare, ? I like the question mark. The inside story on what is happening in Canada. And your topic is really dear to our hearts, as many of us in New Zealand and at the Early Years Research Centre are researching and advocating for free, universal, good quality, public and not-for-profit early childhood education. So we have a lot of interest in what has happened in Canada and in Quebec, and responses to the federal government's incentives to expand not-for-profit early learning and childcare, as you call that. So we're really lucky to have you here to talk. Sue has been involved in policy research and advocacy for 40 years or more. She's played a really important role also in major studies of childcare policy and programs in Toronto and Ontario, and much more besides. Sue is currently president of Building Blocks for Childcare, a charity dedicated to the expansion of private, not-for-profit early childhood education in Ontario, actually. And Gordon is Emeritus Associate Professor at the University of Toronto, where he's taught economics for 25 years. And his research includes analysis of costs and benefits of early learning and childcare, and the ways in which different OECD countries finance their programs. He's examined determinants of quality in childcare, factors affecting childcare workers' wages, ways of measuring affordability, which is really interesting. And so we've used a lot of Gordon's work in advocacy ourselves for quality early childhood education, and particularly for teachers who are well qualified and fairly recompensed. So together you bring that amazing combination of sound research and persistent and shrewd advocacy that is so important in transforming systems. We regard you both as good collegial friends of the Early Years Research Centre, having visited here in 2017, when, amongst other things, you, Gordon, met with Chris Hipkins, who was then Labour spokesperson on education. That was before the 2017 election. And you spoke at the Early Years Research Centre in that year and in 2019. So thank you very much for being available, and I'll hand over to you both. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, my internet's a bit unstable today, so you can let us know in the chat whether there are any issues, and we can try and adjust for that. So you can see my screen, I guess. It's okay? Yeah, okay. Okay, so what I want to talk about is I want to talk about both Quebec and Canada, the rest of Canada. So Quebec implemented a universal early childhood system, or began to, back in 1997, so more than 25 years. And Canada, in the last couple of years, has put itself on the track towards a universal childcare system in the rest of the country. So these are very interesting experiments to look at. Canada not very far along, but Quebec quite far along. So we can learn a lot from what's been happening. Now, let's see if I can get this. Okay. So general picture on Quebec. It's got a strong not-for-profit base to its services. There was rapid expansion in the early years of the program, which led to significant problems, which I'm going to talk about. There are problems of equity and access and staffing, certainly shortages of staffing. But it's been found over time that supply-side funding delivers much better results. And it's now a permanent and much loved social program. No government is now going to be able to take it away because it is so much appreciated by parents and families. So a story and outline for Quebec. Back in 1997, Quebec, and this is a French-speaking province, essentially, with about 8.7 million population, about 420,000 children 0 to 4 years of age. They began phasing in universal licensed care at $5 a day. So $1,300 a year, not free, but very inexpensive at the time. and it hasn't changed that much. It had at the time a progressive and what they called an independentist government. So it actually favored the independence of Quebec, but it was a socialist government with strong female ministers, an important part of the story. And it was in office until 2003. And it built a system in which not-for-profit CPEs, so that stands for Early Childhood Centers, but in French, were the bedrock of the planned system, and they called it educational childcare. At that time, there were only about 80,000 childcare spaces available. Less than 20% of the population was covered. Now there's about 300,000 spaces, over 70%. But the growth in spaces is a big story, an important one to tell, which I'll get to. So it now is risen from $5 a day, but it's still only $8.85 a day, or about $2,300 a year in the fixed fee services. Now, I say fixed fee services because, again, this is a part of the story. The fixed fee services, the $5 a day initially, now $8.85 a day, were the bedrock of the system, but a later government established a parallel system which wasn't fixed fee. I'll get to that in a minute. But there was also good maternity and parental benefits. We can discuss the details if you want to, and publicly provided before and after school care for the same fixed low fee. So, really from 0 to 12 years of age, childcare or early childhood education available at $5 a day, also with a year of good maternity and parental benefits, a basic good system of universal childcare. Okay, now it's not. Okay, there we go. So a picture of the growth, and you can see how it went from about 80,000 spaces way back when in 1997 to about 300,000 spaces now. If you took time to look at this, and I'm going to have to move quickly, so you won't get to look at everything. You might want to drag out the copy of it, the recorded copy later to look at it. But what you've got is a big growth in the number of spaces, but also a change in the composition of the spaces. So the real heart of the system are those black ones at the bottom. Those are the center-based early childhood education, not-for-profit centers. But in order to do the expansion, they also relied on family childcare, and that's the green part of those columns. And then later on began to rely on for-profit care more, which is the blue and the purple. So the expansion after 2005, so remember it started back in 1997, but the expansion after 2005 was in for-profit services funded by tax credits. Up to 2005, the coverage was in fixed fee services, and it had risen from, as I said, below 20% of children to just about half of all children. But then, and this might sound a familiar story, a new government comes in, and the new government has a different idea about where things should go. And over a few years, that new government, a conservative government, its name was liberal, but it's actually a conservative government, and it opened up an alternative channel of funding, a tax credit to pay parents' childcare expenses, but with no controls on fees. So instead of fees being controlled at $5 a day, there were no controls on the fees that were charged. And that, of course, attracted the for-profit sector. As the chart shows, you'll see it in a moment, after 2005, all of the increase in coverage comes from the market-based childcare without fixed fees, where parents receive tax credits to help them buy childcare. So almost all for-profit. And this was the biggest mistake in the development of Quebec's childcare system. So here's the diagram that shows you line is all other kinds of childcare, and then the yellow added on is those tax credit funded childcare centers. So you can see after about 2005, all of the growth really is in these tax credit funded for-profit centers. So one of the good things, and this is the role of academics, which is has been very important in Quebec, was to do studies. And they did studies and encouraged the governments to do studies on the quality of childcare. And so this is the result of one of those studies done in 2014. And again, it would take you a long time to go through it, might be useful. But the first two columns are the CPEs, that's to say those not-for-profit childcare centers, and the last two columns are the tax credit-funded for-profit childcare centers. And what this diagram shows you is that the quality in the, I gotta get rid of this thing here, disappear, okay. The quality in the CPEs on the left-hand side, those left-hand side two columns, an awful lot of it is good quality. That's the green, and not very much or acceptable quality, and not very much of it is of poor quality or fair quality. But in the for-profit centers, much larger percentages in poor or fair quality, some in good, very little in excellent quality. So, you know, these studies have had an important impact in turning around the views, especially of governments and others, on what it makes sense to do in terms of policy development over time. So what's part of the story here on the quality difference? In 2019, for instance, 87% of those not-for-profit centers met the requirement to have 2/3 of staff having educational qualifications, basically a 2-year college diploma. It's actually 3 years in Quebec because of their education system, but only 27% of the for-profit market-based childcare services met this requirement. So in general, it's now widely recognized that CPEs have services of better quality, better working conditions for staff, better trained educators. So there are very strong positive effects that are widely recognized from this move to universal childcare, with its difficulties. Huge increases in labor force participation. Canada was behind the rest of Canada. Now it's in front. Careful studies found that there was about a 13% rise in labor force participation, and most of that full-time. Strongest for mothers with higher levels of education, but still strong for mothers with lower levels of education, so lower income mothers. And it had a noticeable effect on family poverty. A very well-known Canadian economist, Pierre Fortin, did a wonderful study of the impact and found that it more than paid for itself. In other words, in essence, if you take the long run economic impacts of the development of universal childcare, it was a great bargain for Canadian governments. There are mixed effects on children. The children in those CPEs, the not-for-profit childcare centers, did fine, but as you might expect, there were a lot of children in lower quality services. Those family childcare and the for-profit centers were found to be of lower quality, and there was chaos and problems in terms of the rapid expansion of services. This is just basically trying to tell you that there are some difficulties with the service as it exists, despite, I will argue, very strong positive effects. So here you have differences in access by level of income. So this is in 2 big cities, one called Laval, the other Montreal in Quebec, 2 of the biggest cities in Quebec. And it shows that lower income families were less likely to be in the CPEs. The higher income families were more likely to be in those better quality not-for-profit centers. It's a recognized problem, but it's a difficult one to solve. And Quebec's staff-child ratios are not good enough, particularly at the infant level. If you look on the left-hand side there, this is showing all of the different provinces of Canada, and it shows the number of children per staff member for a 1-year-old, and you can see that the Quebec line, that's the black one, extends farther than in all the other provinces. In other words, the staff-child ratios are worse in Quebec for 1-year-olds, and they're not very good for 2-year-olds either. So that is a continuing problem that has to be dealt with in Quebec. The supply and demand situation for childcare in Quebec is really odd. There isn't any longer inadequate supply. As I said, it rose from 80,000 to 300,000 and 300,000 is, covers 70% and more of the number of children in that age group. So there's no longer inadequate supply. Demand and supply are approximately in balance. In fact, there are still now empty childcare spaces, but there are over 50,000 children on waiting lists for a space, but that's a space in the not-for-profit and fixed fee services. Empty spaces in market-based tax credit funded services, and shortages, waiting lists for those in the not-for-profits. So the enrollment rates back in 2019, as an indicator, 96% in the not-for-profit childcare centers and below 80% in the market-based services. So what's happening is that parents are voting with their feet. Really, they're voting with their, with where they want to go. And now the Quebec government has developed a plan to convert market-based services to fixed fee services over the next 5 years. So they're going to convert 56,000 of those spaces that were set up using the tax credit system, and said, that's been a failure. The parents don't want that. And the key there is that the tax credit services did not have a fixed fee. The for-profits could charge whatever they wanted, and the tax credit would try and keep up with it. Government raised it from time to time to keep up with the rising fees. Parents don't like that at all, and they don't like the poor quality in those centers. So those two things have driven parents away from the tax credit funded services and back towards the fixed fee services now that there is some space. This is I liked this quote at the bottom. This is the president of the organization representing the tax credit funded services, saying to the premier of the province, you can't do this conversion of our centers into fixed fee services over 5 years. You got to do it right away. And why is that? Our childcare centers are going to disappear before they can be converted. Our educators are leaving us. Our parents are leaving us for childcare at that time, $8.70 a day. Only the walls will be left. I thought that was very telling about what was going on with the market-based childcare services in Quebec. So the balance sheet on Quebec childcare, it's very popular. It's part of the national identity that parents and children are going to be well supported. Parents now have made it clear they want fixed fee childcare where fees are dependable, predictable, and low. They want childcare which follows regulations on quality and qualifications and pays their staff well so that the staffing is stable, and parents don't want fly-by-night childcare. Quebec's side experiment with lightly regulated demand-side funding for for-profit sector that sets its own fees didn't work. And so the struggle to build a good childcare system continues, but it's gone a long way. We are very long distance along the way to universal childcare, and we have a system that cannot be taken away in Quebec, with very many positive aspects to it. Okay, so rest of Canada, and I'm going to try and finish in 3 or 4 minutes to let Sue tell you the rest of the story. But okay, so we're looking at the rest of Canada, and we now have a huge commitment to build a childcare system from the federal government. Why is that important? Well, the federal government actually in Canada, according to our constitution, does not have responsibility for funding childcare. It can if it wants to, but it's never wanted to before. So now we have this huge commitment to building a childcare system, and based explicitly on the Quebec model. So the federal government in its budget said, we're going to build a childcare system in the rest of Canada based on the Quebec model of the CPEs, those not-for-profit childcare centers. So the promise is that by 2026, childcare will be available across Canada for $10 a day, and predominantly in the not-for-profit and public sectors. So we do have for-profit childcare. Those are going to be grandparented in. And there's going to be some expansion of the for-profits, but fundamentally the expansion will be predominantly in the not-for-profit and public sector. That was part of the agreement that was set out by the federal government. There is, however, a huge staffing crisis, and when you're trying to expand rapidly, that crisis becomes incredibly important. And there's not enough support for the expansion, not enough capital support. Sue's going to certainly talk about that, built into the agreements that have been signed. And now we have the for-profits circling around. There's a lot of money being put in, a lot of money being made available. All of a sudden, all kinds of for-profits that never had any interest in childcare before want to come in, but want not to provide financial accountability. So, general story quickly on the Canada, what's called the Canada-wide early learning and childcare system. This it emerged during the pandemic. Female labor force participation had fallen dramatically in Canada. There was a lot of spending going on to boost the economy. And we had a female finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, who said, hey, this is the time. We've got huge problems with women in the labor force. We need to provide the path back to the labor force for them. And childcare is a really central part of that path. So in 2021, the federal government in its budget announced plans to spend $30 billion over 5 years and $10 billion approximately annually ongoing to build a Canada-wide system. And that included substantial amounts for Indigenous childcare specifically, explicitly following the Quebec model. But as I said, the federal government doesn't actually have jurisdiction in this area, but it's allowed to reach financial agreements with a province or a territory if the provinces or territories are willing. And so that's the mechanism that was used. The federal government said, we're willing to give you a lot of money if you're willing to spend our money in this kind of way. And that's the predominantly not-for-profit and moving down to $10 a day. So all of the provinces and territories signed agreements and drafted what are called action plans, promising affordability, $10 a day eventually, expansion, often to a 59% coverage rate in each of the provinces and territories, quality, promises on quality, on inclusion, on flexibility, and very importantly, that the growth would be predominantly in the not-for-profit and public sectors. Just as a side note, if you don't know Canada well, it's about 39 million population. There's 2.3 million children, 0 to 5 years of age. This set of agreements, all this money that we're talking about, applies only to 0 to 5 years of age. It doesn't apply to school age children once they've reached sort of compulsory school. And if they did reach a 59% coverage rate, that'd be about 1.3 million. 70% coverage, which is what Quebec is now, would be 1.6 million. And we've got about 750,000 spaces right now. So what we're talking about is a doubling of the number of childcare, early childhood education spaces that are available. And the existing action plans will only cover about a third of this. So we're going to be working on this for quite a number of years. Okay, a couple of words about this transformation to supply side funding. We have fundamentally been a demand side funded system in the past. That's been the most important. We had a childcare subsidy system for low income families, and then some operating grants coming in on the supply side to keep parent fees from rising. And so up until now, it's mainly been funded by parent fees in a market system. And we've had substantial amounts of not-for-profit care. Transformation to a supply-side system requires major changes. It requires fixed fees. This, I would argue, is actually one of the biggest mistakes that New Zealand has made. We can talk about that if you like. But it has a supply-side funded system, but it hasn't fixed the fees. And so fees have spiraled out of control in New Zealand and certainly in other countries that are funded on the demand side. But it requires fixed fees as they developed in Quebec, operating funding to cover legitimate costs and cost variations, wage and benefit grid that operators must pay. So you've got to pay decent wages to keep well-educated staff. It requires serious financial accountability and reporting requirements. Again, we can talk about that, but without those accountability and reporting requirements, you don't have a public system that is publicly planned and publicly accountable. You need public planning mechanisms for the expansion of supply. So the way in which supply expands is going to be quite different in this kind of a system. It can be a mix of not-for-profit, for-profit, and public operators, but it has to be completely dominated by an ethos of not-for-profit and public service. So in the rest of Canada, outside of Quebec, there are a whole lot of issues. One is the provincial territorial jurisdiction. It's a strength in some sense because different provinces can innovate and do different things that are good, well-designed for their particular geographic and population situation. But it's a big weakness because there isn't political accountability. So when provinces and territories sign these agreements in Canada, they didn't make an agreement with their own citizens to do that. They made an agreement with the federal government. So now a bunch of them are wandering off and doing things that really violate either the spirit or the letter of what they agreed to with the federal government. So there's slippage, which is important. There's no federal and provincial territorial plans or serious money for expansion of not-for-profit and public centers. There's too much attention and funding focused on the political win, which is the $10 a day affordability, which parents like, and not enough on transforming the system. And there's not yet enough money in high-cost jurisdictions to finish the job. And as I say here, there's the circling of the sharks, for-profits complaining about discrimination, advocating choice, lobbying like mad. To some, they seem like a solution. We know from Quebec that actually letting them dominate the system in a big way is a huge mistake and not a solution. It's something that will be regretted. Anyway, that's it for me, and Sue will carry on from here.
Yeah, Aura, thank you very much for welcoming us to New Zealand, albeit virtually. We'd much rather be here in person because we love New Zealand. But for today, it's going to have to be on Zoom. So it's very nice to be here and see you all, some of whom I've met and many, many I haven't. So thank you very much for inviting us. As Linda said, I'm actually now the president of an organization called Building Blocks for Childcare. And I thought I'd talk a bit about why we need this organization called Building Blocks for Childcare. And really, we established it in 2005 when the Liberal government of that day made its first foray into creating a national childcare system. And unfortunately, so what we realized at that point was, oh my goodness, if we're having a national childcare system, we actually have to have a body that can actually expand public and non-profit childcare. Because if we don't, the corporate the childcare operators will come in and basically take over. And we've always in the advocacy movement and have always been very strong proponents of public and not-for-profit early learning and childcare. So in 2005, as I say, we did create Building Blocks for Childcare, known as B2C2. But it was, we actually had a Conservative government elected about a year later. The first action of that government was to cancel all the agreements for the National Childcare Plan. And so eventually B2C2 had to sort of back off. But when we received this announcement from our finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, in 2021, we realized, okay, we better get it going again. And I think that the reason we thought we needed this organization is because in Canada, and I'll talk a bit about the history of this in a minute, but in Canada, we've been very obsessed with advocacy. I mean, there have been a lot of feminists, socialists, unionists, and educational reformers that have fought very hard to expand and improve the quality of our early learning and childcare system. But the problem is we've never had a service organization that has been able to go out and actually create new not-for-profit childcare. It's been very it's just been very occasional, so that occasionally the governments would have a bit of capital money that non-profits would get, or the municipalities would get a windfall in some way or another, and we'd be able to expand a bit the not-for-profit system. But in general, it's not like a childcare center has the has any interest in expansion. Like our childcare centers are nearly all run by, well, not all, but most of them are run by parent boards. And what do parents want? Parents actually want good service for their children while their children are there. They don't want their directors or their staff to go out and have meetings with potential corporate charities to actually, do expansion. They really want their fees to be used to actually make sure that the childcare, their own children get good services. So there's a bit of a conflict of interest in a way between developing not-for-profit childcare and operating parent-run, community-driven childcare centers. So that's a little bit of background about why we set up, because really they don't know how to go about it. So we developed all these various programs and services that we thought we could help to provide in order to be able to help local programs expand without them having to take away a lot of their own resources and put them into expansion. Yeah, so that's the four major things that we see ourselves doing is that we would support all the agencies and programs that are applying for funding. So helping them through all of that process of risk assessment and budgeting and financial management and getting your design together and getting approvals from government, all of that sort of stuff is one aspect of our agenda. The second one is to help expand existing programs from their current enrollment to full operating capacity. And you're probably like us, during COVID, there was a huge shrinkage of actual usage of childcare spaces. And so we're still building back that operational capacity. So helping with that is another feature of our program. And then thirdly, we see that, we have a lot of programs. About 65% of our programs in Ontario are in schools. So there's a lot of capacity in schools to be able to renovate and retrofit, to expand the existing centers to provide more spaces. And then finally, we are also there to help childcare centers to be able to select an architect, do the design, and to construct and to go through with the whole construction process. And I probably should have mentioned before why we think this is so important. And you think, well, why would you even bother if it's just happy? You've got the majority of not-for-profit childcare and things are in the country. I mean, we have a majority of not-for-profit childcare and things seem to be moving along. Why do you need to do this? And the reason really is because there is going to be so much money in the system. If we're reducing parent fees down to $10 a day, with the government paying 80 to 90% of the operating costs, that is what attracts the for-profit operators to the honeypot, and they swirl around because they see this as a great opportunity to enhance profit. And so realizing this, we figured this is why we have to have an organization, not only that advocates for better programming, better funding, and so on, but also actually helps to get these programs up and running. because the demand is going to be so huge within a few years. Now, we're already seeing it, we're already in crisis. I mean, one of our board members actually has 16 centers, nonprofit centers in her area, and their waiting lists are already at 1,000 children on the waiting list, and you know, there's just no way that those parents are going to be able to get that without an increase in supply. So we see ourselves as part of the solution, and we're really an early learning and childcare expansion agency, and we're very much really like something you probably have too, which is associations of co-op housing, nonprofit housing, social, you know, community recreation programs, etc. And our modus operandi is really about collaborating and liaising with municipalities, school boards, childcare programs, and community and Indigenous organizations. So all of that is what we are trying to work on. We have a very talented team. When we decided to set this up, we realized we can't just have childcare people in this. We have to have people who are really experienced in managing, expanding, and operating early learning and childcare programs. We need to have architects. We need to have people who've been in the housing sector and have done a lot of nonprofit housing or co-op housing. We need, you know, educators. We've got early childhood educators. We also have to make sure that we represent a diverse and inclusive, the diversity and inclusivity of our population and from across the province, as well as everybody being very dedicated to nonprofit and public. And I should say to Linda, no, we're not just about private expansion of private nonprofit. All of us would prefer public, but it's just that in this particular conjuncture, it's you know, the public agencies are just being assaulted. They're not getting any money. They're feeling like they have to privatize. It's not a good moment in history for us to suggest that all the municipalities take over and run our early learning and childcare programs. It wouldn't work. In fact, a lot of them have already divested the programs that they once had. So the context for this is, and I'm only saying this because it's been such an important part of the whole struggle, such an important part that the Prime Minister acknowledged in his announcement about the $30 billion for the National Childcare Strategy. He acknowledged that this has come about because of 40 years of advocacy on the part of advocates for early learning and childcare. And it all started back in 1970 when we had a Royal Commission on the Status of Women that recommended universal daycare, it was called in those days. And I just want to make the point that language changes over time. So we don't like to get bogged down on language. You know, daycare it was once, childcare it then became, so that we made sure we took into account the needs of shift workers and so on. And then we moved on to early learning and childcare to represent the fact that our unified position is that the child is always at the center of the struggle, but it's also really important for the whole system to be organized in such a way that it allows, particularly women, but families too, to actually be able to organize their lives so they can work, and so that we don't see a backsliding of women's equality. So we've got those two aims that are very interlocked in our movement anyway. And the other thing that's always been very fundamental is the push for funding, and the push particularly for direct operational funding on the supply side, as Gord would say as an economist. We've always pushed for, let's not have parent fees, let's make the government pay. So this was one of the reasons why this has been a very good move in Canada, that we've had this huge amount of money and that it's gone to construct a system. The problem is that because it's so politically popular to reduce the fees to the parents, right? It meant that the federal government decided that they were going to put 88% of their funding into reducing fees and only 4% into improving the wages of the staff, which are appalling in Canada, and also that there was very little capital money in order to be able to expand to meet the demand. So you can see we've got this, we really have this dichotomy where it's great that we have this money. It's great that the parent fees are going to be reduced and we're going to have a fixed fee system. But without these other pieces, it's not going to work. And so we are part of the solution of building blocks for childcare, but we also recognize that there has to be continued advocacy in order to challenge the particularly the for-profit operators who are really swirling at this point. They are really making a huge noise about how they should be included, how parents should have their choices acknowledged, how they can do it more efficiently, how they're very good quality, all of these things that we are trying to get away from because we want a publicly funded system, might include some for-profits, but we want it to be publicly managed. So that's, I think Gord went through this. We have the strategy, we have the federal budget with 30 billion over 5 years and 9.2 billion after that, continuing every year. The reduction of fees to $10 a day. And as I said, it will create huge demand, which we are already seeing. And the government has so far, and they've put this in legislation, by the way. The legislation has been tabled, it hasn't passed yet, but they've got this in legislation that growth in spaces will predominantly be in the public and not-for-profit sectors. Underpinning all of our work in the advocacy movements are the four principles: high quality, which really means for most of us highly qualified staff. That's how we see high quality. The way we would measure it is mainly around the quality of the qualifications of the staff. A universality. We're not a nation that we're not a nation that actually leans towards targeting. We actually believe in universal programs in Canada. We have a universal medical system. We believe that nobody should be able to pay extra in order to be able to get better healthcare because they're richer. We believe in universal education, and 97% of children in Canada attend public education schools, right? We believe in public, libraries and obviously old age pensions and things like that. So we're lucky that we have this universal kind of perspective that we can carry forward, because otherwise I think we'd be ending up having, only a lot of childcare for poor kids, and then we would be segregating and it wouldn't be so good. But as Gord mentioned earlier, we still have to emphasize that the most organized parents are still able to get their kids into these programs much easier than low-income kids. So we still have to make sure that we have programs that are geared to making sure that these programs are accessible. So affordability and accessibility is another key unity principle of ours. And by accessible, we also mean accessible to children with special needs, whatever they are, making sure that there are resources, enough resources in the system to pay for their inclusion in childcare. And affordability, we seem to have won that one, but it may result in problems, but that's always been a key for us. And then the public or non-profit is the other major guiding principle. So I think now that Gord and I would be happy to answer questions if we have enough time left. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sue and Gordon. It was really amazing to hear all these actually stories from kind of taking that universal principle to early childhood, to also kind of facing some issues that we have, although we don't have like that sort of luxury. So I'm actually looking at a couple of questions raised in the chat box, and I'm wondering, would people who wrote those questions would like maybe to read them out, or they would like us to read the questions? One of the first was from David Cook, if I'm pronouncing the name right.
Well, yes, thank you very much. And it's a very straightforward question that Linda Mitchell has addressed for many years. As I understand ECE in New Zealand, it's largely or mostly private, for-profit. This seems to me totally counter to the Quebec experience. How can we change that?
Yeah, I'll try a bit of that. I mean, you're asking the question, of course, and it's not easy. I mean, in some sense, the starting point is to get agreement or to publicize, to argue, to suggest, to get governments to agree that fundamentally what we're doing here is we're designing a public service. That's what it is. If it's universal, it is a public service. It's delivered by private operators, but it's a public service. Okay, now if you agree that it's a public service, there are a lot of things that go along with that. So should it be the Australian example? I don't know whether Kiwis love or hate Australians, but I'll give some negative things about Australia here. I mean, they've got a childcare system in Australia where the fees just keep going up and up and up and up, and every successive government comes along and says, throw more money at it, you know, higher subsidies for parents. It's going to be funded on the parent side, but oh, the fees keep going up and we can't, you know, it's a disaster. Well, yeah, it's a disaster because you designed it as if it were a market service. You decided you can't control the fees, you can't set the fees because it's a market. And you've got to fund the parents, and the parents are then going to pay for it. And the parents then become the gatekeepers for how the market works. Well, I'm sorry, but when you're paying the majority of the money from government, the parents aren't a very good gatekeeper. I mean, it's not like a private market. I teach economics, right? And I mean, there's a lot of people that say that somehow or other this is a market and it's competition and that works wonderfully, and you know, we're going to get these wonderful results if we fund on the demand side because we've learned the theory of competitive markets in our first year of university. Well, that theory doesn't apply to this market. I'm sorry, it doesn't apply to this sector. I mean, in many ways, which we could discuss, but basically, no, it's a public service that we're designing. So that means a whole bunch of things for me, at least. It means, yes, you're going to set the fees. Yes, there's going to be strong measures of financial accountability. There's going to be strong measures of reporting. There's going to be a huge amount of government funding that goes into it, but we're going to try and run it for the interests of the children and the parents who it's supposed to serve. So all of the decisions, all the policy that we set up have to be designed to make it into a public service. Well, once you have that lens of a public service, once it's really accepted that the lens is the public service, the issue of for-profit becomes weird. Like, why would you, you know, now let me get this straight. And this is what I've argued in Canada. We can have for-profits in the childcare sector, but they need to accept the rules of the game. And the rules of the game are, yes, our objective is to deliver a public service and all of the things that go along with that. And that means controls on the amount of profit that you earn, and, you know, financial accountability and assessments of quality and monitoring of the services you provide and so on. And that goes along with it. If you are willing as a for-profit operator to accept those rules of the game, then you can join with the not-for-profits and the publics in delivering the service. We don't want a majority for-profit, because in general, what happens is they then begin to rewrite the rules of the game. But you know, there is a possibility of grandparenting in the existing for-profits and having them accept the rules of the game, and then that can work. So anyway, that's the way I see it.
Thank you, Gordon.
I just add a couple of very quick things. I mean, in terms of actions, I think that, as Gord said earlier, that the fact that they did these quality surveys in Quebec was very powerful, because, you know, I mean, what do parents know often about quality? They don't. But if you actually do studies that are well publicized, that show that the quality is better in the not-for-profit sector, that can go a long way to actually beginning to make the case. And the second thing I'd say is that pushing for this fixed fee system is a really interesting way to separate the chaff from the wheat, because, you know, then you'll find most of the for-profit operators will not want that system, and but governments can be persuaded that it's much more beneficial to them than the tax credit way of doing things. But I know you have different anyway in New Zealand, but I would argue for a fixed fee, a low fixed fee system.
Thank you.
Amazing questions and responses. Thank you so much. We have probably time for one more question, although in the chat box we got I think 3, 4, 5 different questions. So I'm like wondering which one would actually there is no name. I think it is just Mare.
Me.
Would you like just to ask one of these? I'm sorry, we will be like just answering probably one. If you like just to pick up maybe one.
Sure. I guess well, you know, I had quite a few questions, but perhaps answered a little bit by Sue in her presentation, but I wondered whether the opening up in 2005 to the sort of tax credits type approach in Quebec was about expansion not being fast enough in the number of places from the fixed fee services, and if that's the case, then what were the barriers to growth for those services?
Yeah, maybe I'll say a couple of things, but it entirely goes into Sue's presentation, which is to say, yes, the barriers were that the not-for-profits, it's not their mission to expand in general. That's not their DNA, right? I mean, they don't think of expansion as the thing that they're trying to do, whereas the for-profits say, yeah, how do I make more profit? You know, my mission is to expand. So it means that you do have to provide a lot of support of the kinds that Sue was talking about in order to get over that barrier. But your initial instinct is completely right, which is the government argued that the reason why they had to turn to the for-profit sector was to expand supply quickly. And they did expand supply quickly, but they now are regretting what they did. So it's a bad bargain that they ended up with. Sue?
The other thing that is absolutely critical, and we're facing now, is the lack of capital, because of course the corporate sector has access to capital. That's what they are really, is in investment houses, right? Whether it's in real estate or financial equities or whatever. And in the not-for-profit sector, banks are not interested in funding us. You know, they just don't want to do it. They don't think we're a good risk. They don't think that they don't like the public perception. And what if we failed? We'd have to close down a non-profit center. There's just very bad. There's very few possibilities for capital expansion in the not-for-profit sector, which is why we're really pushing the federal government to introduce a program of loan guarantees, either through a crown corporation or through a land trust or just through an actual program where they would give loan guarantees, and then we would be able to get the money back through through good operational budgets, right? So that is a huge problem. And then we're also exploring, well, is there a way that we can put together some kind of charitable trust that actually can raise money for capital? But that's down the road. But all of these things are huge in terms of this fight. And if we can't put them all together, we're not going to win. They're much more powerful than we are. So you have to wish us luck.
If I could just ask my final two questions about the, I guess your slide where you had the fixed fee services are less accessible, or low income families are less likely to access those services than high income families. Are you able to talk about what the drivers for that are, or why that might be?
Yeah, I think Sue alluded to it, which is, we're talking about mechanisms that really don't have anything to do with the childcare system in some way. They have to do with the way in which society is, right? And so, it's powerful, it's difficult, which is, middle-class parents, they know where things are. And they're also sure that they're going to be in the labor force. Often the mothers are, whereas in a low-income family, it's might cycle in and out of the labor force. So you're not quite sure, should I move quickly to get a child care space? So the middle-class families move quickly. They have good networks of information. They know the studies, and they say, yeah, the CPEs are really good quality. Let's put our kids in there. So that's the kind of thing that you're fighting against. So these are normal mechanisms. So you do have to then build into the child care system ways to fight against these normal tendencies in society. That's true, but the mechanisms are really have to do with the way in which societies work.
Yeah.
Another, just on that, are those services not located in those communities, or is that something that might be a barrier as well, or is it more just about the labor force participation of low income?
Not particularly, because I mean, one of the things about middle class families is that they're prepared to drive anywhere to get their childcare. They have cars, for one thing, and so if they can get their name on the waiting list ahead of everybody else, then they can drive one kid here and one kid somewhere else. I mean, that's the kind of story you have of parents going all over town in order to get the best childcare, or they're on a transit route. So it doesn't necessarily mean, I mean, our government has now actually targeted the latest expansion spaces to priority neighborhoods, but that doesn't mean, unless you do a lot of really priority targeting, which we don't tend to go into, as I explained, in Canada, unless you do priority targeting, then that's not going to do the trick. We're going to have much more proactive measures. And I just wanted to tell a story about very quickly that we have these alternative schools in our public education system that are really great. And they're completely dominated by middle-class parents who know all about how you go and queue up at 8 o'clock in the morning on the day of enrollment, and they know how to get their kids in, and so on and so forth. It's no accident that they're more organized to actually access. It's not that the others are excluded. It's just that, as Gord says, it's the way capitalist society really works.
Let me just say one final thing, though, because I had this debate with a journalist, which was who information about Quebec and said, oh, well, they have the low-income families. The whole system in Quebec is terrible. If you do the comparison in between the system in the rest of Canada and the system in Quebec, even though relative to higher income families, low-income families in Quebec have done worse, nonetheless, relative to the rest of Canada, where we had a market fee system, low-income families did much better in childcare. Many more of them were in childcare and gained benefits from it. So they're not in the best childcare in Quebec, not in as big numbers as the high-income families. But again, the comparison is more, yeah, we got to do better in a universal system in Quebec, but that universal system is already doing much better for low-income families, even though it's not good enough.
Mm-hmm. I think the problem too is systems are very complicated. It's really hard to narrow them down to a few paragraphs to explain them all, especially when you have 13 provinces and territories, all of which have completely different legislation and policy, actually. So it's hard to, synchronize it all.
Thank you all so much. We have so many more questions, but unfortunately we don't have more time. What I would suggest probably is that people were asking about maybe some publications or maybe some reports that they can access and probably gain more understanding about the system, and probably inspiration what we can do in the context of New Zealand and in context of our issues that we are facing, which actually are somewhat similar to yours in Canada.
You can send questions on to us. I mean, I think I'm happy if you share my email. Sue might well be as well. You know, for other questions or stuff. I also have a blog that I regularly publish on, and there's a bunch of stuff on for-profit and not-for-profit childcare on it. You know, most of it is Canadian, but some of it is in relation to other countries. I even did one on the New Zealand funding system recently, but you can share that the address to that blog.
Right.
I think
and
actually,
if you want to know,
you already put a link to your organization
website.
Okay.
If you want to see more detail what we do, and we also have studies and reports and so on that they're up on our website.
That would be brilliant. And I think that would probably address so many other questions that people might ask. Thank you also so much for coming today. It was absolute privilege to have two amazing speakers and so many amazing questions, and probably many more that we couldn't address at this time. Thank you all so much for coming. And I will just close the meeting with closing karakia. Mate whakapono, mate tumanako, mate titiro, mate whakarongo, mate mahitahi, mate manawanui, mate aroha, kataya, atato, tihei, maoriora. Thank you all so much for attending the Elias Research Center, and we hope to see you in our conference later this year. Please get in touch if you would like a recording of the seminar, and also along with the recording, we will share the links to blog and to Sue's organizational website. Thank you all so much.